Your Worship, you're pretty much right. You have taken up most of the time for questions, so we'll try
But
and get
probably
through
I answered them all anyway, right?
You absolutely did. So I wonder if anyone does, we'll try and get through as many as we can.
We'll do lightning round.
We'll do lightning round. We'll go on the wind theme. We'll be breezing through this really quickly.
Okay.
You spoke about the engagement process with Calgarians to build the budget. One of the things you and your council members are facing right now are a variety of what I call forced choices on priorities.
Sure.
And there's a lot of conversation around Calgarians aren't willing to make the cuts that come with some of the holding the line on certain budget. And we agree. Thank you very much for trying to keep that line held in our smart spending bandwidth. We totally agree with you. But did that process yield the information that would enable council to say, we know when Calgarians have a forced choice and have to give up X to get Y, or was it, and I apologize for the term, but was it just a wish list? Do you actually know what Calgarians will say, yes, we're willing to pay more for, and what we won't?
There were 3 reasons for doing that engagement. The first was really to help people feel like they have skin in the game and they understand those forced choices and they understand those trade-offs. People do have skin in the game. The decisions that we make impact people's lives every day, but we wanted to open the veil and let them get in and see it, and I think that worked really well. Number 2 is that engagement process actually forced us as a city to be able to communicate much better about what it is we do. Just the act of having everyone who works for the city explain in 1 paragraph what their department does was remarkable, because people had never been asked to do that before. And number 3 was to look for good ideas. And certainly we did get good ideas. I mean, the thing that we learned, which wasn't really much of a surprise, is that Calgarians recognize that we pay the lowest residential property taxes in the country, and yet we receive very good services. And the vast majority of people said to us, look, we want to preserve those services. And even if it costs us more, we're willing to pay more. 72% of Calgarians surveyed said they're willing to pay more for the same or greater level of services. And that's fine. And I think a lot of my colleagues have been relying upon that. But I also believe that regardless of that, we still have to prove that every penny we're spending properly. And I think that was the big learning. It wasn't stop doing this stuff, but make sure you can prove to us that you're doing it as efficiently as possible. And that's really what we've been working on.
And so you spoke to the residential sector. Now, what about from a business perspective? When you look at Calgary's overall tax burden, we are a little bit in the higher side of average from a business perspective. I know council is looking at the streamlining of property tax and business tax. When you can speak on the business side of that angle.
So, you know, Calgary remains one of the only cities in Canada that has a standalone business tax, a tax just because you're a business. And I was very pleased earlier this year when council agreed with me and the chamber that we should consolidate the business tax with the non-residential property tax. And we're going to start that process. We're going to go about it very slowly to make sure that we don't run into any unexpected friction or deadweight loss in the system when we do that. But we're moving forward with that. Now, I was teasing Ben Brennan, who's here, when he was at council last week, because he pulled out these charts showing our business taxes and property taxes, and it's a famous survey by the City of Edmonton. It's online. And as I recall, he had charts 4, 5, and 6, and the chart I always use is chart 7, which is the next one down, which shows, in fact,
10 minutes before we went into the presentation.
Yeah, they took it off because it actually shows that when you meld residential and business taxes, we're still way below average. But they're the chamber; they're not allowed to say things like that. But I think that when you look at the overall tax burden, it is very fair. It is true, as the CFIB always reminds us, that we have quite a large gap between residential and non-residential tax. But there's a reason for that. The reason for that is because we have skyscrapers and big shopping malls. So when you look at cities that have skyscrapers, you'll see that there's always a difference because the assessment of a building like the Bow is really high. And in fact, we're right in the pack with cities like Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver when you take that into account. So I think that the balance we've got right now is a fair balance, and I think it's the balance that we probably need to continue with.
And what about communicating that balance, or even the residential versus business? One thing is that when everybody gets their tax bills, you get that little pie chart that says of your $1 of tax, X cents goes to this, X cents goes to that. What about the business side? The business community doesn't have that kind of transparent breakdown. Is there movement afoot?
Well, it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same pie chart. Just the numbers are a little bit different. And you know, I have an argument with a particular lobbyist for industry who always says businesses pay so much more and they get so much less, which is a crazy argument to me. Can you actually argue that businesses don't benefit from roads and transit and fire service? Maybe you can argue that businesses don't benefit from that portion of our taxes that we spend on recreation and arts and culture, but I argue, of course they do. How are you going to attract people to live in a city where there's no hockey teams for their kids to join? You know, it all is really part of the same system. So I would argue to you it's the exact same pie chart.
Moving on to some of the audience questions. You talked about the 5% budget increase that you wanted to go with. The question is, how did you arrive at that specific target? As inflation is closer to 3%, and the growth component that should come with growth, and also does that increase that we're talking in council for the budget, does that include the provincial portion as well?
Good question. Technical question. So how we arrived at that, the 5% is municipal inflation plus growth. And there's been some attempt to have a totally artificial argument about whether municipal inflation should be used instead of consumer price inflation. The difference is 0.7%, by the way. And in fact, many would argue that since such a large proportion of the city's budget is wages, we should actually use wage inflation. Do you know what wage inflation in Alberta is right now? 4.7% year on year. And as a matter of fact, the deal that we signed with our unions at 3% for 3 years is well below expected wage inflation in Alberta. And that was the biggest proportion of our tax burdens. So the reason we have to tack on growth, I'll just say this very briefly, it has to do with the fact that the property tax is a lousy way to fund cities. Lousy. Because we don't participate in the upside or the downside. So as the city grows, the increase in property tax from new homes at the fringes don't pay for the services needed to provide those new homes with those services, which is why it has to be inflation plus growth. So it's 3.7 plus 1.3 equals 5. And I think that makes sense in the aggregate. Should it be 4.5 instead of 5? Well, we can have that argument. It's a difference of about 40 cents per month to the average house. And so in my mind, it's not much worth having the argument. Now, we're going to end up probably somewhere around today, right now, this minute, we're sitting at 6.125%, which is more than I would like. I would have preferred to see it much closer to 5. But again, that's a difference of about $1 per month to the average household. And so, you know, we're really debating at the margins at this point. As for the provincial portion, well, the province shouldn't be taking up this property tax anyway. So it's a complex system. Sometimes they match us, sometimes they don't. City Council passed a policy that if they don't match us, if they come in below us, that's called seeding tax room. What we will do is we will move into the tax room, but we will not use it for operating purposes. We'll use it for things the province normally pays for, and I have to go cap in hand to ask them to pay for. And our priorities are debt reduction for the city, as well as capital projects that the province would normally fund. So it remains to be seen what the province will do. We've got to change this system. It's completely broken. And I think the new Premier has an appetite to do that.
Yeah, you know, we've long agreed with that position. There's a need for significant municipal finance reform. One thing Premier Redford did mention on Friday was the notion of, in some ways it's about the dollars, but in other ways it's about the certainty.
Yes, absolutely.
And I wonder if you could speak to what your view of that balance is.
So Mr. Marr, when he ran for the leadership, suggested that the province would vacate the education portion of the property tax, give it all to cities, but in a revenue-neutral way, so that the province would no longer be funding the capital things that they fund now. That had an advantage and a disadvantage. The disadvantage was it makes us even more reliant on the property tax, which, as I've said before, is a regressive, awful, horrible way to fund cities. The advantage was certainty. So I'll give you an example. The Southeast LRT will cost, in rough numbers, around $3 billion. 2.5 times bigger than the second largest piece of public infrastructure we've ever built before. My entire operating budget is $3 billion. So you imagine that it is impossible for me to borrow that amount unless I've got some certainty of cash flow on how to pay it back. So the province had offered us $300 million to get started on the Southeast LRT. But what do? Do you build 2 stations from nowhere to nowhere with no certainty that you'll ever be able to extend the stubway, as I called it, to where people actually live and work? You know, or do you figure out other ways to use it? And the point is, if you don't know if anything's coming after the $300 million, it totally skews your decisions. So if I had long-term certainty of cash flows from the province and the feds, then I could borrow the money to build the Southeast LRT, get it done, and just like taking out a mortgage, pay it back over time. But if I'm not certain of what my cash flow is, it would be really irresponsible to do that.